Hi, I'm Park Howell, and welcome to the Business of Story, where purpose-driven people like you learn how to craft and tell compelling stories to grow your revenue and amplify your impact. If you would like to clarify your story in under 30 minutes, visit me at businessofstory.com, because you gotta own your story to grow your brand.
I thought it was just a stupid picture of a pig in the ocean. But after hearing that story, I had to have it. Now I wasn't just buying a picture, I was buying a story. Story literally made the picture worth more money to me.
That's what businesses are about. People buy brands, people buy stories much more than anything else.
I work with a lot of big enterprise companies, but let's just say I always tell folks, drop the PowerPoint, close your laptops, start with your story.
If you want people to get engaged and you want people to act, you have to tell them an emotionally powerful story. That's with great characters, it's with uncertain outcomes, and it's with high stakes and drama.
All business strategy is a story.
Just this past Wednesday, I literally fell out of bed with a case of vertigo. In fact, I even still feel a little bit fuzzy today. This is Sunday. Now, I've never experienced it before, that I sat up in bed, flopped my feet on the floor, and away I went. My brain was suddenly bombarded by a kaleidoscope of opaque tubes, kind of like you're falling through a narrow ice cave. That's about the best way I could describe it. Talking about an altered reality, the room whirled around me and I was grasping for anything I could. I finally caught hold of the bedspread, kind of like it was a rope dangling off a cliff to arrest my fall, but down I went. I mean, totally mind-blowing. Well, luckily, I was able to get into my doctor that morning. She said my vertigo was caused by a mild case of rhinovirus. Now, I don't know about you, but describing anything by the name of rhino as mild seems a little understated. At least it did to me in my current state. Well, after some steroids to tame my mild rhinovirus and a couple visits to my physical therapist, COLLEEN, who is trained in head manipulation maneuvers that are designed to round up these free-range crystals that were gallivanting about in my inner ear that was ultimately causing the vertigo, well, I'm feeling much better. And by the way, here's a little public service tip for you should you or someone you love fall prey to vertigo. There is this great video on YouTube by Dr. Carol Foster that demonstrates a simple exercise you can do at home, essentially the same kind of treatment I received from my therapist, and I found that it was extraordinarily helpful. We'll have a link to it in our show notes if you're curious. This all brings me to the topic of today's show, and it actually brings it all a little bit more in focus. This is all about virtual reality and using it with your business stories and your branded content. Now, have you ever put on a virtual reality headset? When I use one, I can sometimes experience the same sort of vertigo symptoms, although not quite as extreme. Virtual reality, or VR, is the most visceral way to experience a story through film and video. That's why I'm pumped to have on today's show one of the pioneers of narrative virtual reality storytelling, Bryn Mooser. Mooser is the CEO and co-founder of RYOT, the leading immersive media company in the world specializing in virtual and augmented reality. He and his team at RYOT launched the first ever VR global news show and comedy series. He is a twice Oscar-nominated filmmaker who has overseen the production of more than 200 linear and immersive films. RYOT was also a finalist in the 2016 Emmy Awards, as well as a Peabody Award finalist. Adweek just recognized Mooser as one of its 100 most creative people, and in recognition of the purpose-driven mission of RYOT, he also received the Nelson Mandela Changemaker Award. Pretty amazing guy. RYOT has made such a profound impact in virtual reality storytelling that Verizon's AOL purchased them a few months back, and now they are part of the Huffington Post's global video operations. So on today's show, you'll learn the elements of great storytelling from Mooser's VR point of view, how the resilience of the human spirit is a fundamental theme in most storytelling. And for me, one of my big takeaways from our conversation is how we can all be open to new ideas like storytelling with virtual reality, even as the medium and the industry is still trying to find itself. So let's get into our show today that might just make your head spin a bit with VR pioneer Bryn Mooser. Bryn, welcome to the show. It's such an honor to have you here.
Thanks, Park. I'm so happy to be here.
You know, though, when I watched your interviews and I did some of my research and that sort of thing, man, it made me feel like this guy has done so much in such a little amount of time. I don't know how you put it all together. How did you get your start? And I actually want to go back to even your childhood, because there's got to have been something as a young man that really triggered both the humanitarian in you and the rogue filmmaker.
Yeah, I think for me, I was lucky enough to have two parents who instilled a spirit of adventure and were gypsies and totally restless growing up. So, as a kid, I grew up in New York City, in LA, and in Maine. And then at 16, I went off to Zimbabwe, where my mom was a Fulbright scholar. And she encouraged me to take my last year of high school off and move with her to Eastern Zimbabwe. And that really put me on a path, I think, to being curious about the world and also wanting to keep moving, exploring, and seeing new places. So I give all the credit was to my parents for being fearless and encouraging me to go, go, go.
Wow, and they say just go ahead and take your senior year off, come to Zimbabwe. You're going to learn way more out of life than you are in that high school, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what, they knew that because they traveled a lot themselves. And, but I look back on it now, after I went off to Zimbabwe, I went back to college at Bennington College and studied film. I went to Berklee College of Music briefly to study jazz. And they encouraged me all along that way. And then I decided I wanted to join the Peace Corps. And they encouraged me to join the Peace Corps too. So I shipped out to West Africa, the Gambia, for about 2.5 years. And I look back at that now and, I don't have kids yet, but I'm going to have kids soon, hopefully. And, for me, I hope one day I can be as brave as they were in letting me run off. Because when I think about letting my kid join off to run off to the Peace Corps and the trouble that we got up into there, I don't know if I would be as brave as they were, but I certainly hope I show some of that bravery and grace because, my time in Zimbabwe, my time in the Peace Corps, were instrumental into kind of putting me on the path to start RYOT.
Can you tell me one of your hairiest adventures in Zimbabwe or the Peace Corps that would actually make you think twice about encouraging your child to do that?
Well, look, I mean, when I moved off to Zimbabwe, I was 16. And I think that, 16, 17 are some of the most formative years for boys, certainly for girls as well. I mean, the first time I ever fell in love was in Zimbabwe. The first time I rode a motorcycle was in Zimbabwe. The first time, I got drunk or smoked pot was in Zimbabwe, so all those formative experiences that open you up and go, man, the world is more, is bigger than I thought, is more interesting than I thought, these kind of, all the things that you learn up until you kind of have those experiences get shattered. And so, for me, like that time really kind of opened up my mind. And I don't know if it was just because that time transforms everybody, or if it was also heightened because I was in a beautiful, far away, exotic country. But those were definitely moments I think that influenced everything else that came before. In the Peace Corps, you're by yourself for the most part. I lived in a little village called Sarasofi, which had about 500 people in it. No electricity, no running water, no internet, no cell phones. This is 2001, so very early. And, there's nobody, keeping an eye on you really, except for the community, which, is kind of are your best caretakers at that time. But, there's not like a Peace Corps administration that's saying, hey, do this or don't do this. You're really a part of the community. And so, when I was there, I had some run-ins with hippopotamus. I had some run-ins with some cobras that were too close for comfort for me. And I had some run-ins on motorcycles that probably shouldn't have, and I had a couple run-ins with the local law enforcement too that I think would have probably. I don't even think I've still told my parents those stories. So I survived and was stronger for it. And look, I think that the great lessons you learn in the Peace Corps are two. One is you learn how to fail in the Peace Corps, and that's really important because you go in thinking you're going to save the world and save this village, and right away you learn the complexities of foreign aid. You learn the complexities of a Western relationship with the developing world, and you learn that this kind of like savior complex is a lot more complicated and deeper and nuanced than I think you think when you're a 21-year-old going into these places. So you learn how to fail, and you learn how to be resilient, and you learn that resilience from watching the community members be resilient in the face of drought or in the face of political turmoil or in the face of natural disasters. And you are instilled with that resilience when your projects don't turn out the way you think that they would. And you pick yourself up off the ground and you either quit and go home, which many people do in the Peace Corps because there's nobody stopping you from taking a plane home, or you stand up again and you try again, and you try harder and you try better. So you learn that.
It sounds like then you're the walking example of it takes a village to raise a Bryn.
Yeah.
From what you learned in all of that.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And, look, I mean, being in I think in the West, in America in particular in this day and age, we're so removed from these really important constructs of community. It's really rare to get a community that rallies around raising a kid. And that part where a village is keeping an eye on a kid is like, that's real. That's how we're at our best when we're a community, when our lives are in service to that greater community, where we're thinking not selfishly, but we're thinking about how our actions impact the rest of our tribe. And so I think, that certainly is still part of what drives me, is learning to see how a community functions, like a real, village community functions, which is really back to the basics. And you see how, in many ways, in the end of the day, on people's deathbed, the people in that village weren't remembered by, how much money they had made. In this case, it was peanut farming in the Gambia. People weren't remembered by how rich they were. People were remembered by what a good person or a bad person they were to the community. And that's what they passed on as their legacy. And that's what every single person who came into contact with that person would remember them. And, and that's still true here. But we forget it sometimes. So, those lessons, I think, were powerful.
And then how long thereafter did you move on and do your work in Haiti, I guess following that devastating earthquake, and a lot of the work that you did out there was pretty amazing.
Yeah, I was, I left the Peace Corps and I said, I need a break from living in a mud hut with no water and electricity. And so growing up, I had always been a musician, so I went off to Berklee College of Music to try to be a professional jazz musician. I play the tenor saxophone.
Oh, really?
And I studied there for about a year, and it was too hard for me to be in a music conservatory because I just had so many other interests running around my head. It was really hard to be in a community that just talked about music all the time, and so. I went to Bennington College. I studied film, and when I left there, I came home to LA, worked in television, and I got to know a couple people who are really involved in Haiti. This is before the earthquake. I met an amazing writer-director named Paul Haggis, who you probably know. He made Crash and wrote $1 Million Baby and the Bond films, and he had met a Catholic priest named Father Rick Frechette, who had been living in Haiti for 30 years. He had met him at a fundraiser in Rome, I think, and was struck by, what an amazing speaker and person this was. And so he said, hey, I'd love to come visit you in Haiti. He went down to Haiti and soon after that met Paul, and it changed Paul's life. Paul had never seen, I think, poverty like that, and he had never seen impact working on that sort of scale. So Paul really became an evangelist for Haiti, and anytime he could bring anybody down, specifically from the entertainment community, he would. And I was lucky enough to go on a trip with him in 2009 before the earthquake. It was me, Josh Brolin, Diane Lane, Maria Bello, a couple other actors, and I got to meet Father Rick down there and was blown away by meeting an extraordinary human and seeing the work that he had done. So when the Haiti earthquake happened, I was lucky enough to be asked by Paul to help build an organization post-earthquake, to see if we could continue the good work that he had been doing around elementary school education and expand it to secondary education. So I moved right after the earthquake into the children's hospital that Father Rick had built in Port-au-Prince.
And then you also helped found a school there that has educated many, many Haitians.
Yeah, that was, look, Paul and his organization, Artists for Peace and Justice, had been focused on elementary schools before that. So he had supported, a handful of elementary schools, really in the worst area in Port-au-Prince called Cité Soleil, which is, sort of the slum, the most dangerous spot. But it's also an incredibly vibrant part of the city. And Father Rick had built some elementary schools in there that he was that we were supporting as Artists for Peace and Justice. But Father Rick had said what my dream always was to build a high school, because so often secondary school is kind of forgotten, or it's too expensive, or kids go to elementary school but then they don't have a place to go for secondary school. So we made that our focus. Right after the earthquake, moved down there, raised a lot of money after the earthquake, and started to build almost immediately what is called now the Academy for Peace and Justice. I was just at the first graduation, which is it has 7 grades, so it's been 7 years since we built it, and there are 3,000 students at that school right now, and it's one of the things I'm most proud of that I was a part of building. And it's a free school for kids from that area, Cité Soleil, and it's something really special to see.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredible. And just think about it. If you stayed at Berkeley in those, little audition rooms, I guess, for lack of a better term, where you've got to sit there and practice your tenor sax to become a great jazz person, you would have never had this sort of impact. I mean, I know I studied music myself, composition theory at Wazoo, and I knew the really good performance artists, they just had to sequester themselves in these practice rooms and spend hours on end, and I could see why that wouldn't appeal to a person like you who travel the world and you have your hands in a lot of different things. So
yeah, well, that's actually, it's interesting you brought that up. That was the day I left Berkeley. Was I was in one of those rooms, and I was practicing getting ready for a review where I was about to be sort of graded on my sax abilities. There were little tiny rooms. They looked like little telephone booths.
Oh yeah,
the soundproof rooms, but you can still hear the other people on the other side. And I was practicing some Charlie Parker solo I was supposed to learn, and I was slogging through it, ba ba da ba da ba da, just struggling through it. And I heard in the room next to me some kid play the same solo, 5 times faster, perfectly, because he had heard me struggling and kind of wanted to show off. And I put my head down, I packed my sax, and I never went back because I knew that the reality was I didn't have what it takes to be as good as that kid next to me, and because I didn't have the discipline to sit in a box for 10 hours a day. So that was what sent me out.
Well, what I love about that, that's the universe, man. The universe says, hey, I'm glad you have this interest, but I need you to do something else, so I'm going to put this 16-year-old prodigy next to you, and then let's see how you deal with that.
That was a guardian angel.
Actually, we're going to go see Herbie Hancock tonight. I've never seen him. He's playing at the Mesa Center for the Arts, so we're looking forward to that.
Oh, that's going to be amazing. He's one of the greats.
Oh, yeah, very, very iconic. Now, you have these world experiences. The humanitarian is coming out in you, and you have this artistry. So you've got the music background, you've studied film. When did 360 storytelling come into play, and how did that come about?
While I was in the Peace Corps, it actually sort of went back to the Peace Corps. I joined the Peace Corps in 2001, right after September 11th, and wanted to give back to the country. Didn't want to go off to war, wanted to try to be a positive impact. I'm a patriot, so I was lucky enough to live overseas for a lot of my life and see how extraordinary lucky it was. I was born to a great family that, gave me every opportunity to see the world. So I always wanted to kind of give back as a thank you for this sort of like lucky set of circumstances that brought me. I went off to the Peace Corps. It was 2001. And like I said, there were no phones in this village where I was. In fact, the Gambia, there weren't really telephone lines up country at all. It's a very small country that follows along a sort of a river going up country, and they didn't really have telephone lines. And so one of the projects I was working on was sort of helping communities get ready for these landlines that were coming into the country. So we would work with local villages and talk to them about what they could use a telephone for. It's for emergencies, it's to contact your family, like all the things that we take for granted about telephones. you can imagine a place that never had a telephone. And so, what was, I think, the great irony and the great sort of moment for me to get on the path of RYOT was right as they were about to kind of dig the first pole for a telephone phones to come in the country, a cell phone tower popped up country. And within 6 months, many, many people up country had mobile phones. And they abandoned bringing landlines up country.
So they just skipped right over that linear technology.
Right over. Yeah, and that's that was a big thing that you started to see all over the developing world, is that I think you think that people go from no telephones to a landline to then a mobile phone, but in many parts of the world, people skipped that. They never had a telephone; they just went straight to having a mobile phone. And now I think what you're seeing again, or over the last certainly 3 or 4 years, is that people never had a computer. They didn't go from having no computer to a computer, to a desktop, to a laptop, to a smartphone. They went from we never had a computer or a phone to we had a smartphone that can do Facebook and WhatsApp on it, et cetera. So, or Skype or all those other things. And so I think what I got a chance to see were huge leaps in technology that was happening all over the world. And cell phones were a huge part of that. When I was in Haiti, I watched how social media and smartphones were revolutionizing how people got access to information. And so I saw in the Peace Corps how mobile phones were going to be transformative. And in Haiti, post-2010, I saw how social media was giving people an opportunity to access all of the world's information and distribute their own information. So 2 things happened. One is there was a democratization of distribution of content. And the second thing, which has happened over the last couple years, is a democratization over storytelling. Who can be storytellers? And you have a moment where you're empowering people through the power of their phone with the camera on it or with the microphone on it to be able to be their own content creators. And that's a revolution. And that's something that I think I thought about. Well, if anybody can tell their own story by posting it on Facebook, then how do we make sure that we build, how can I be a part of building a company that can help people tell their own stories and highlight stories that maybe the traditional media wouldn't cover?
What strikes me about that, Bryn, is that you were like in the throes of actually witnessing digital Darwinism, for lack of a better term. Yeah. So in the developing country, we went from our fax machine to our cell phone and everything in between, but out there literally in the bush, they didn't do that. They just went, boom, right to their digital device.
I think when I started thinking about RYOT, I said, well, if we can tell powerful stories and we can use social media to distribute those stories, and if we can get our friends who are, influencers or celebrities or people who have important social media voices to help us distribute them, then in many ways we have almost an equal footing for then the big media companies, right? I think it's important to remember that, in the past, you'd have a handful of people who'd control all the world's information, right? Like William Randolph Hearst or Rupert Murdoch or whoever. They were the people that were able to influence what the narrative of what people were talking about on the street, because they had the money to print newspapers, to hire journalists, and to distribute those newspapers to all of the right places where they needed them. And I used to think about it all the time. If you're the Santa Monica local paper, you can never compete against the New York Times, because the New York Times can get their newspaper into the Santa Monica bodegas, but Santa Monica, daily newspaper can never get their newspapers into all the street corners of New York City. So it really was about who had enough money to get the message out. Well, social media had the ability, still does have the ability to flatten that all out. And if people are distributing their content through social media, then we all have an equal opportunity to get those messages, those stories, those words out. And actually, the advantage goes to the great storytellers. The advantage goes to the people who are nimble enough to work it out and figure out how to make that work. And the disadvantage goes to the kind of big publishers who are so bulky, who are so slow to evolve, and who have so much overhead budget of cars and trucks and newspaper printers and all those other things, that actually the smaller, more nimble publishers can win. So it's like Malcolm Gladwell talks about David and Goliath. And I think, in the past, it's like, oh, Goliath, of course, is going to beat David. But Gladwell always says, like, no, David should have always beat Goliath. He's faster. He's in better shape. He doesn't have some like glandular disorder that makes him a mutant. And so I think that was the moment we saw. Now, what's interesting is that it was also the climate that bred fake news. It was also the climate that allowed, Russia to interfere in publishing fake news stories. Like, that moment is a revolutionary moment for all sides. And it's the same moment that allows you and I to do an amazing conversation over our phones and computers, rather than having to somehow schedule time at Capitol Records Store, Studio One or something like that. So.
Well, and with that democratization of distribution and storytelling, it ultimately leads to freedom for all. But in that freedom, you are going to have some dark players in there that are going to use it for evil intentions and not good. It's just they go hand in glove. There's a terrific book. I don't know if you've read it. It's one of my favorite that speaks to this whole idea of the democratization, starting literally back from the telegraph to where we are today. It's called The Master Switch by Tim Wu.
No, great. I'm writing it down. I'm going to get it right now.
Oh, you'll love it. If you're traveling next week, jump on. And here's what I'd recommend. Bring it. Have a notepad and paper with you, because he covers so much detail. It's worth writing down the names. But he talks about, it's all about the monopolistic, the monopolies that have always controlled the master switch, or the communication vehicle of the day. So he covers every single one, including movies. And his big question he poses at the end of the book is, now that we've got the democratization of the web, who is ultimately going to own that master switch, or can we truly keep it free for everybody? So that's
the great question, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, and that's what, you look at Facebook and the power that Facebook wields to turn things on and off, to ratchet things up. Google, I mean, those are very, very, very powerful forces. I think for the most part, their politics align with the things that I believe in, and I'm sure you believe in, which is, freedom of speech, curbing hate speech, like whatever it is, like it feels aligned in a kind of more socially progressive environment. But I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night imagining what if Google and Facebook were alt-right mouthpieces that were controlling the message, and we were on the other side of it. You could see how you quickly get to a totalitarian sort of dystopian world if you have one person who can control that. And right now you got Mark Zuckerberg and Larry and Sergey at Google, who could be incredibly influential in the way that people see the world, and they are influential in that. So I can't wait to read this book, because it's a lot of what I think about. And people say to me too, like, oh, the fake news, how do you know it's true or not? And I say, look, you got to look back at history. Like, how do you know how any of this stuff has been true? There's always an agenda. At least now they're trying to come out and be clearer that there's an agenda, because before this, we never take sides on a story kind of wasn't true. And so it's definitely a revolutionary moment where you're putting the power back in the creator's hands. And I think it's up to all of us to try to do our best to make sure that we do it for good rather than for evil.
And Bryn, when you guys, I think it was it the earthquake in Nepal where you really got your start with RYOT, and you sent a crew in, but instead of just shooting traditional video, you decided to go in and shoot 360 video, but you didn't really have the apparatuses, the apparati? I don't know what's plural of apparatus to do that, but you guys literally, from what I could tell, took GoPros and cobbled them together and then had to stitch and edit all of that footage together?
We had always been shooting and telling, traditional documentaries inside of disaster zones and war zones for a long time. My partner David and I had been humanitarians for a while. And I think we had also been frustrated about how limiting the traditional frame is. Like if you think about a photograph, when you're covering a natural disaster, you take one photograph, it's easy to manipulate that. It's easy to not capture, or it's hard to capture the scale of what a disaster really feels like when you're standing there. And so we would have to try to capture that with the films that we made. And when I think we saw our first virtual reality experience inside of a headset, we both clicked and said, man, imagine how powerful this would be to help people better understand a natural disaster. And so Just so happened about the first virtual reality film we made was about solitary confinement, where we put people in a headset and had them experience what it felt like to be in solitary confinement. We help raise money with that experience to help end, juveniles in solitary confinement. And we played that film at Tribeca Film Festival. And afterwards, a friend of mine came up and showed me this little GoPro apparatus, which was GoPros in a 3D printed case, all kind of, hobbled together, and said, hey, this is what the next generation of VR cameras look like. And it was very exciting. And the next day, the earthquake in Nepal happened. And I called him, and I said, hey, man, can I borrow that camera? Brought it to Nepal, and we shot the first ever virtual reality experience inside of a post-natural disaster in Nepal. I think that what struck me was we made the film, we came home, we asked a friend, Susan Sarandon, to do the voiceover so that I think we'd get a little extra media attention about it. And Susan has been a supporter of a lot of great work in Nepal for years before the earthquake. We went to a film festival in Telluride, Colorado, and went to show it. And, it couldn't be programmed because it was so early and people didn't know what to do with VR that we just stood outside the movie theater and put the VR headset on people as they walked past. And pretty soon there was a line of people around the block who wanted to experience VR and experience what it felt like to be in Nepal. And almost every single person who took that headset off was crying or was moved. And so as a filmmaker and as a humanitarian, I think we were both struck about how this medium can not only show people the scale or size of a disaster, but also can elicit an emotion that a traditional typical video couldn't do. And when they took off the headset, they said, hey, I want to help. How can I help? And, we sent them to great organizations on the ground that they could make a donation. And from there, we started making VR films all over the world. We made the first VR film in a war zone in Syria. We made the first VR film swimming with wild dolphins. We helped make a VR film up to the top of Mount Everest. And since then, we made about 250 all over the world. And that pioneering spirit into virtual reality is what led us ultimately to become acquired by AOL, Verizon, and now we're a part of this new company, Oath, which is AOL and Yahoo combined, and Verizon. So it's been definitely a wild ride from the Peace Corps to now we're sitting inside of a major company, and we're really excited about what's possible.
Well, and I think your experience of living in mud huts and sleeping on the ground paid you dividends, because I read somewhere when you were still building RYOT that you guys were basically sleeping on the floor there and spending like no money on an apartment just to put all your money and your time and energy back into your films. And what, did you go to the Academy Awards or was it the Emmys? And as you were staying there, you realized you might be the only director there that doesn't actually have a home to go to?
Yeah. There, right before we sold, there were about 4 of us who were sleeping on the floor of the office because we were putting every dollar back into the company. And so I couldn't justify, the tiny little salary I was paying myself, putting that into rent somewhere. So I was sleeping on the conference room floor, and I would get up off the floor at 7 in the morning, take a quick shower. We had a shower in the office, thank God, and put on my clothes for the day before the rest of the team showed up, because I didn't want them to think that their boss was sleeping on the floor of their office.
Was truly homeless.
Yeah. That if that instilled a lot of faith that they should dedicate their life to this company. But anyway, we made a film called Body Team 12 about the Ebola crisis, and it was nominated for an Oscar in 2015. So I had to go to the Oscars. I had no money. This was only 2 years ago. And I had worked with Kenneth Cole, the designer, in Haiti, and he became a good friend. And I wrote to Kenneth and I said, hey, I'm about to go to the Oscars. I can't afford a tuxedo. Can you help me out? And he made a custom tuxedo for me and my partner. We wore that. And I did realize standing, right before they called our name as nominees at the Oscars, in the big fancy theater, I looked around and I thought, well, for sure, I'm the only Oscar nominee this year, or maybe ever, who was homeless during the time of the Oscars, because I took off that tuxedo, which was a gift, and went straight back to sleeping on the floor under the conference room table.
You're just living your brand purpose, that's all. So if we can talk just a minute about the technology and sort of the rogue nature of this. Help me, what is the difference between 360 video and virtual reality?
I think the early VR that people were seeing was really just 360 video. So 360 video is a different way of looking at a traditional video. I think the big moments in history for 360 video was about a year and a half ago, Facebook and Google with YouTube both supported 360 video, which meant if you're watching on your phone, you're watching a traditional video, you can move your phone around and see video all around you. So if you're doing that in a headset, it's the same thing. You can also use your cursor to drag it around and see it. I think by now most people have seen 360 video on Facebook or YouTube. If you're looking at it in a headset, it starts to get closer to virtual reality, but I think that definition was complicated and kind of confusing for a while. The work that we did was definitely more 360 video for a virtual reality headset, but I think we're starting to now see something closer to true virtual reality, and the promise and potential of virtual reality is incredibly exciting / dystopian and disturbing, but we can get into that later. But it's where, you can put on a headset, you can see your hands, you can interact with the world around you, you can move around in the space around you, and what you're seeing is like this kind of almost blurring between, are you in a virtual world or are you in the real world? And that's what I think is very exciting as filmmakers. How do we really start playing with that? How do we start exploring that? And can we get somebody to not know the difference between the two and start to question maybe the reality that they're in right now, the base reality that they're in right now? And that's a very fun thing for filmmakers to start to experiment with.
And they're making these cameras now with this GoPro mindset, too, that are VR cameras. Have you heard of this camera, Vuse, V-U-Z-E?
Yeah.
Yeah, our son, Parker, who's a filmmaker in Hollywood, he's really gotten into virtual reality because it brings in his mixed media. He's a motion designer, but also a director, and he works now. Views has brought him in to create a film for a festival in Berlin at the beginning of September, and he was talking about how much fun it is and how easy it is to use these cameras, that really anybody can use it. So where we used to have GoPros and you'd run out and put on your surfboard or your bike or whatever to capture that you can do the same thing now with VR in pretty amazing quality.
Yeah, that's, that we're seeing that, faster and faster. In fact, I'd be worried if I was a camera company because it's changing so fast and so quickly. I think that, just to back up a little bit, like back to kind of the foundation of roots of how technology kind of influenced RYOT from the beginning. Look, when I studied at Bennington, I was at film school. This is, 1998, 1999. And I wanted to make films like, Martin Scorsese or Quentin Tarantino or whoever my heroes were, Godard, Fellini. But I never had enough money to make a beautiful film on 16 millimeter because 16 was just too expensive to shoot. So I had to make these like really great stories and things that I thought were brilliant on video, and they looked cheesy and they looked terrible. But, if I got a chance to shoot a little on Super 8 or maybe a couple minutes on 16, I knew that I could make something beautiful. And but I never had that chance, and I think it was really a hard thing about being in film school to like have your tools limit your creativity. And now you pull out your phone and you've got a 4K camera on your iPhone, which is like, if you put the right filter on it and a little, lens, you could almost trick somebody into thinking it was 16 millimeter. What an amazing moment that is, that as creators, as kids, like your son or, like yourself or whoever is walking around with a camera in their pocket that's as good as any camera was, 15, 20 years ago, and they have the tool at their disposal. And they've got an editing suite, with iMovie inside their camera too. That's amazing, right? That means that you've got an opportunity to get new voices, new people, all of these things right on there. And so I think that like camera technology improving isn't just like a thing of convenience, like, wow, I could take better pictures of my holiday. The revolution is that it means that you can radically transform who are the storytellers of today. And it's not going to be limited by, whose uncle runs Capitol Records or Sony Studios.
Right. But just because you have the technology doesn't mean you're actually a good storyteller. And what I see is, VR, like anything, is really amazing because it immerses you tactily into the story as the viewer. And a lot of people, I think, filmmakers get lost on the gimmickry of that. Where does narrative come into play? And regardless of the technology, how important is narrative to storytelling to literally take us from point A to point Z?
Storytelling is everything everything still to this day, thank God.
Yeah.
Right? Which is, I don't care if you're shooting a thing on VR or if you're writing a blog or doing a podcast or writing an article in a newspaper, like you got to tell a great story if you want to get people to get to be passionate about it and then to come back the next day for it. So we're lucky that that's still central, and it will always be central from a drawing on a cave wall to an augmented reality experience on the top of your desk. You got to tell a great story and suck somebody in.
And Bryn, what do you think are the elements of a great story? Say you just brought in a new director, a new storyteller, and you say, here at Riot, we like to do it this way, and these are the elements that we're trying to capture in every story we tell.
I think that we're drawn, there's a unwritten kind of connection to all of our films that is about the resilience of the human spirit and in the face of the human condition, right? I think that there's something about all of our films that is still the story of people standing up against all odds, of people being brave, of people leading by example in their communities and leading others into doing the right thing. We don't go out and say, go tell us that story over and over, but it's, Riot is still made up. We've got 100 and something kids who work, well, not kids. My dad is one of the people here who's here, and he's 70, so I shouldn't say kids. We got 100 and something people who work at different parts of Riot, and all of them are ragtag group of kind of orphans who have found each other, and I think we're all drawn by that same story. And that's because a lot of us are lucky enough to go and travel overseas, and I think it's the thing that you see over and over. When somebody goes to a refugee camp for the first time, you don't hear them say, oh my God, it's miserable. The first thing you hear most people say is like, wow, I was really surprised that there's a store, or they're listening to Justin Bieber there, or actually they play soccer every day. It's always this human connection that people see that happens in the rest of the world. Or despite those circumstances, I saw somebody dancing and laughing. Wow, that blows their mind. Those are the stories that I think we end up telling.
To use the theme creator of there's nothing in Riot that makes sense except in light of capturing the resiliency of the human spirit.
Yeah, that's the greatest story.
When you're out there grabbing those stories, are there 2, 3, 4 things that you're trying to do? The old beginning, middle, and end, the hero's journey. Is there anything that comes down to that sort of format or structure that you go for? Yeah,
I think that every, there's only 4 stories in the world or something. I believe that there are a handful of stories that are the archetypes to everything, and we make sure that we don't oversimplify them. We've just made a film this year about a Canadian woman who goes off to join an all-women's brigade fighting ISIS in northern Iraq and Syria. That film is called Fear Us Women. It'll be out soon. Her name's Hannah. She's an extraordinary woman, but I don't think she fits any archetype of what that person you want her to be. If you just heard that that's what the movie was about, in your own mind, you'd come up with 15 things you'd want her to do and say and be. And I think that we try to buck the stereotype with that all the time. But it's undeniable that after you watch that movie, you don't get a sense that wow, you've just watched somebody who believes in something, they're willing to give their life for it. And I think everybody re-examines in some small way the things they're doing in their own life. Mm-hmm.
And with everything that's happening now in Charlottesville and our White House and the nationalism that is not only here in America, but seems to be, affecting a lot of countries around the world, why is it, or is it, storytelling like you guys go at, storytelling with impact? Why is it maybe more important and timely now than ever?
Yeah, people are losing sense of what's real and what's fake now. People are losing sense of community. People are isolated and afraid. Communities, rural communities, I think, are really starting to see crumbling like they saw in the inner cities in the 70s and 80s. It's an incredibly dynamic time in America, and it's an incredibly delicate time globally. So I think it's more important than ever that we highlight humanity, love, compassion, community, because we've got a lot of work to do. I don't think people realized how much pain and suffering was happening in this country until this election, and it was a shock to everybody how much anger there was, especially on this side of these kind of like alt-right or even the Trump movement overall. And so if we don't figure out a way to start healing, fixing, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. So I think that storytelling is very important, and community has never been more important. So it takes a village, I think, to raise somebody, and it's going to take a village to put it all back together.
I interviewed a friend of mine, Paul Blavin, who owns a production company.
Oh, I know
over
Paul.
There. Do you?
Yeah, that's great.
For Good.Earth.
Yeah.
He's he's unbelievable. He's a good friend of mine over here, moved over there, and just became a movie and music producer.
Paul's great.
Yeah. And I asked him, I said, what kind of film production company do you have, Paul? He goes, I don't have a film production company. I have an impact production company, and I simply use film to make our impact, to share voices of people. And he's coming out with a new movie in October called Molly, which I got a chance to see a year ago, and I couldn't believe how incredibly well done it was, and the producing of it. My last question for you, Bryn, and for all of those, our listeners are folks, are business leaders and communicators of purpose-driven organizations that are trying to make and have an impact. But you also hear from Fox News and the right, or you hear from the disenfranchised out there, oh, here's some more do-gooders. It's the far left, it's the left radicals. How do you guys create stories that don't get shunned? That no, we're not here, we're not bleeding hearts, we're just trying to share with you, as you said, the resiliency of the human spirit. But how can you do that to make an impact versus coming across sometimes looking sort of modeling like some people do?
I think it's the greatest question. My whole team has been committed to taking the conversation out of the coffee shops and salons and moving it into the tailgate parties, right? We've got to figure out how to make this a national conversation around compassion or community or all of these things, and stop just being the echo chamber that we find ourselves in. So, if it takes telling a story and putting it in a virtual reality headset for somebody to want to line up around the block and listen to it, I'll do that. If it takes doing it as an augmented reality experience on your tabletop, I'll do that. I think by any means necessary, we've got our work cut out for us. And I just know that story, passion, and those things are going to be what kind of gets people to get on the bus rather than, get out of the way or make fun of it.
Yeah. Well, Bryn, I really appreciate it. I know you're very busy. I'll let you go, but I did want to do one more shout out to our daughter, Corbin Winters, who made this all happen. Corbin worked with you and your wife on your wedding, and then actually did some work in your studio, your new studios there. And without her, we wouldn't have had this connection. And she's with Powwow Design Studio out of San Diego. So I just had to give Corbin a shout out.
Well, Corbin is, I think, one of the most talented people I've had the honor of running into and working with. When my wife and I decided to get married in Joshua Tree, which is very dear to our heart, we found Corbin. She made the most beautiful wedding, I think, that most of the people all said they'd ever been to. And now she came to the Yahoo corporate offices here in Playa Vista, California, and she made them so cool. So I'll send you some pictures, and you should share them because she made our offices cool here. She's the best. And I'm so glad that we got connected to have this conversation. It was really perfect.
Well, I appreciate that. And send me your photos. I'll put them certainly up on our show notes. She'll love that. And she's great. We love her. Bryn, I want to thank you again, and I want to thank all of our listeners for tuning into this special edition of Business of Story, where I get to bring story artists like Bryn to you so you can understand how to maybe better craft and tell your own stories, to clarify your stories so that you can amplify your impact. And of course, if I can be of service to any of you, you know where to find me. I'm at businessofstory.com. I got a ton of tools there that you can download for free to start working on your story. And the last thing I'll leave you with is, the most potent story you're ever going to tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. And until next week, have a wonderful life.